The moment Ethan stepped through the diner doors, something felt off, and that strange air made the title of this whole situation echo in his mind, just like a warning he couldn't explain. A billionaire ordering the cheapest meal should never have been a big deal, yet the way the staff stiffened told him the smallest thing could break something fragile in that place. He kept his head down, wearing the kind of clothes no one would ever link to a man whose decisions shaped thousands of jobs. From the corner of his eye he noticed two workers whispering, their voices low but heavy, talking about another paycheck deduction, like it was a storm that came every week. That single phrase rattled him more than he expected, and without showing it, he felt a tightness rise in his chest. He walked to the counter slowly, studying every detail, as if the truth of his own company was hiding behind the coffee machine or buried under the scratch marks on the menu board. Then he asked for the cheapest item they served, a small meal almost too simple for the kind of man he was, but he needed to see something he couldn't put into words yet. Maya greeted him with that polite smile that didn't match the fear he sensed floating in the room. She looked at him with calmness so sincere it almost smelled like courage, though a flicker in her eyes gave away the dread she was trying to bury. He watched her turn toward the kitchen, watched the tension ripple down the line, and he wondered how a place that looked so normal could be hiding something so wrong. Every tiny movement around him made him feel like he had stepped into the heart of a secret nobody dared to name. And inside him grew the silent thought that this meal, the one he picked only to blend in, would become the doorway to a truth big enough to tear apart the empire he built. Ethan found a small table near the window, close enough to see everything happening behind the counter, without looking suspicious. He could tell right away that the rush wasn't just from customers, it was from fear. The cook's shoulders were tense, like he was holding up a weight no one else could see, and every time he turned toward the orders, his hands hesitated before moving. Ethan felt a slow guilt creeping in as he realized how far he had drifted from everyday operations, how he had spent so many years dealing with numbers and meetings that he no longer knew how it felt to stand in one of his own franchises on a busy afternoon. Maya moved with a kind of practiced grace, helping the cook, greeting customers, grabbing drinks, and giving smiles that seemed too warm for someone who barely had time to breathe. There was something tender in the way she apologized for delays, how she checked on elderly customers, how she thanked families even when they left crumbs and wrappers behind. But the way her jaw tightened whenever the kitchen printer beeped gave away a different story, one that didn't match the kindness she offered so freely. Ethan leaned back slightly and realized that if someone as decent as Maya looked this worried, then something had gone very wrong under his watch. He wondered how many places just like this were living under pressures he never approved, how many workers carried the weight of decisions he never actually made. That thought burned through him slowly, pushing him to keep looking deeper, and with every passing second, he felt the pull to uncover whatever truth hid behind those careful smiles. When Maya brought him a cup of water with her usual gentle tone, Ethan knew it was time to test the strange tension he felt around him. He looked at the meal slip she left on the table, then slowly stood and returned to the counter. In a calm voice he told her he wanted to change his order entirely, switching from the cheapest meal to something completely different, something more complicated, something that would force the kitchen to stop and readjust. It was the kind of shift that should have been normal, something any restaurant could handle without panic. Yet the silence that followed was loud enough to make his heartbeat quicken. Maya froze almost without meaning to, though she fought to recover her friendly smile. She told him it was no problem, but her voice trembled just a bit, almost like she was praying the cook wouldn't explode. When she turned to fix the ticket, Ethan watched the cook's face drain of color. The man's hands tightened on the spatula, and his breathing hitched as he rushed to undo the first meal and start the next one. Maya stepped between Ethan and the kitchen, as if trying to shield the cook from being seen in such a fragile state. She apologized again, her eyes soft, but behind them, Ethan saw a panic she didn't dare show fully. For the first time, he felt a deep, cutting suspicion that something far worse than simple stress was controlling the rhythm of that kitchen. He sat down slowly, feeling his chest tighten as the cook whispered something too faint for him to catch. It wasn't the reaction to a changed order that unsettled him. It was the raw fear that seeped into the room the moment he asked for something different, and Ethan couldn't stop thinking about why such a tiny request could carry so much weight in a place that should have been safe. Ethan stayed quiet, pretending to check his phone while focusing on every sound behind the counter. He finally heard it clearly, a low, tired voice from the kitchen saying he couldn't take another deduction this week. The words felt like a hit straight to Ethan's stomach. Maya whispered back, telling the cook she would handle it, that mistakes happened, that things would be fine, even though her eyes said the opposite. She carried herself like someone used to absorbing panic to protect others, someone who acted as a cushion between real fear and fragile hope. When she turned toward Ethan again, her smile returned, gentle and warm, but he noticed the edges of exhaustion framing her expression. She asked if he needed anything else, and he felt a knot form inside his chest, a knot made of guilt mixed with a growing anger at the idea that someone out there had approved a rule so cruel it made an entire team afraid of a wrong sauce or a burnt bun. He watched the cook rush from one station to another, almost stumbling, and Ethan felt a sense of shame building, wondering how many times people like this suffered while he sat in boardrooms far away. Everything around him started to connect slowly, each detail adding weight to the rising pressure inside him, pushing him to face the truth instead of ignoring it. And in that tightening silence, he realized that what he uncovered today might force him to confront parts of his empire he never wanted to believe existed. When Maya walked the corrected order to his table, Ethan saw the way she steadied the plate with both hands, as if holding more than just food. She placed it gently in front of him, thanked him for his patience, and turned to leave, but something in her expression made him speak her name softly. She froze for a second, then came back, standing a little closer, her polite smile fading into something more honest. He told her he noticed the tension, that he sensed fear, that he didn't want to get anyone in trouble, but needed to understand what was happening. Maya hesitated, glancing around the diner like someone checking for danger. After a slow breath, she explained, her voice almost a whisper, that every mistake, any mistake, was deducted straight from their paychecks. If a burger was burned, if a drink order was wrong, if a ticket had to be reprinted, workers paid the price themselves. She said she tried to hide the stress so customers wouldn't feel guilty, because kindness shouldn't come wrapped in worry. Ethan felt something break inside him as he listened, a mix of shock and shame rising through him, like a wave too strong to fight. He had built an empire believing it treated people with dignity, and now he saw how blind he had been to the damage done under his own name. Maya apologized for speaking so openly, but he thanked her quietly, knowing nothing in his life would stay the same after those words, and as she walked away, he knew there was no going back. He had stepped onto a path that would force him to expose truths powerful enough to shake the foundation of everything he created. Before we jump into what Ethan is about to uncover, take a second and pause the video to tell us in the comments where you're watching from, or if you've ever worked in a place where small mistakes caused big pressure. Your comment really helps keep these stories going, so go ahead and write it now, then come right back so we can continue. After hearing Maya's quiet confession about paycheck deductions, Ethan felt something heavy settle on his chest, a weight he couldn't ignore anymore. As she stepped away to help another table, he asked gently if she could spare a moment later, and she nodded with that same polite smile that now carried a different meaning for him. He watched her move around the diner, noticing how she seemed to carry every emotion of the kitchen, smoothing things over, calming workers, keeping customers from seeing the cracks. When the crowd died down a little, she joined him at his table, wiping her hands on her apron, almost apologizing for taking up space. She told him more, explaining that it wasn't just big mistakes, but tiny ones too, things no one should ever lose money over. Her voice stayed steady, but he could hear the exhaustion beneath it, the kind that grows after months of pretending everything is fine. Ethan listened quietly, nodding slowly as each detail made the guilt in him grow stronger, not because he had approved anything like this, but because he had been so distant that someone else could do it in his name. He asked if the cook felt the same pressure, and she nodded again, glancing back toward Luis, who pretended he wasn't listening. When Luis finally approached, he only did so because Maya gently waved him over, reassuring him with a look that said she trusted Ethan more than he deserved. Luis kept his voice low as he explained how deductions hit him for things as small as grabbing the wrong sauce cup or dropping a bun. He talked about weeks when his check came up short, and he had to choose between gas and groceries. Ethan felt himself gripping the edge of the table, fighting the urge to reveal who he really was right that second, wishing he could undo every fear these people carried. He thanked them both softly, and they accepted his gratitude with the quiet humility of people used to being overlooked. That was the moment something shifted inside him, not just shock anymore, but responsibility settling deeper, like a promise forming before he even spoke it aloud. After leaving the diner, Ethan walked toward his rental car with a tight jaw and a mind racing faster than traffic on the highway. He pulled out his tablet the moment he sat down and searched internal files, old memos, policy changes, anything that could explain the mess he had just stepped into. The more he scrolled, the more the pit in his stomach grew. He found signatures that looked like his, but dated from months he barely remembered. Approvals stacked with corporate jargon about loss prevention and efficiency enforcement. None of it sounded like the company he tried to build, and yet it had his name attached. Something had been pushed through under layers of paperwork, slipped into standardized rules across regions, without anyone bringing it to him directly. He felt anger rise, not toward Maya or Luis or any worker suffering under this nonsense, but toward the structure that allowed something so harmful to exist quietly in the shadows. As he dug deeper, he saw the same language repeated across the country, similar deductions popping up in reports from states he hadn't visited in years. It hit him like a punch to the chest when he realized this couldn't be a single manager's bad idea. This was bigger, deeper, woven into the system like a hidden thread that no one bothered to question because it saved money at the expense of people who could least afford it. He leaned back in the seat, exhaling slowly, feeling the full weight of what he had allowed to slip through by trusting too many layers without checking how they treated the workers at the bottom. And he knew this wasn't something he could fix quietly or quickly. The fear he saw on Maya's face, the tired shame in Luis's voice, those weren't local problems. They were symptoms of something that had spread farther than he could see from one visit alone. That realization settled over him with the force of a storm, and he understood that the meal he ordered today had become the spark for something much bigger. If one diner was living under this pressure, then countless others might be suffering from the same unspoken rule, and the question that hit him next was the one he couldn't shake, even as he stared out the windshield trying to steady his breath. If this was happening here, how far across his empire had this policy already reached? Ethan drove straight to the regional office, with the same heavy feeling sitting in his chest, the kind that makes a person move faster than their thoughts can catch up. He called Dana on the way, his voice steady but edged with something she hadn't heard from him before. When he arrived, she was already waiting in the small conference room, holding a tablet and a worried look. She greeted him politely, unsure why the owner of the entire company had shown up unannounced, and he thanked her with a softness that surprised even him. He started by asking simple questions, trying to understand who first approved the paycheck deduction idea. Dana hesitated, shifting her weight before explaining that it had been passed down through several managers, each one adjusting the wording, making it seem standard. Ethan listened with his arms crossed, feeling guilt rise inside him, not as a sharp pain, but as a slow, spreading weight that made every breath feel different. He asked why no one questioned the ethics behind it, and Dana explained that lower regions often copied upper regions, assuming rules were carefully checked at the top. Her words hit him hard, showing him how distance had turned into blindness, how small choices could pile up and create something that crushed the wrong people. She spoke gently, almost like she was trying to protect him from the truth, and he thanked her again. This time with genuine appreciation, because her honesty mattered more than she knew. She opened a folder on her tablet and slid it toward him, her hands almost trembling, as if she feared his reaction. Inside were reports from the last 2 years, pages filled with deductions from hundreds of stores. Ethan scrolled slowly, each line tightening the knot in his chest. Deductions for a spilled drink, a wrong topping, a cracked cup, a misprinted receipt. The numbers added up in ways he didn't want to see, and before he could stop himself, he whispered that this wasn't the company he meant to build. Dana looked at him with a mix of sympathy and caution, telling him that many managers believed the rule helped control waste and improve discipline, though she admitted she never liked it. Her voice softened as she said she always wondered how employees were supposed to survive when part of their paycheck could vanish over a simple mistake. Ethan felt something shift inside him, not just guilt now, but a determination that wrapped itself around his resolve like a promise he couldn't avoid. He apologized to her, saying he should have been closer, and she surprised him by thanking him for caring enough to come in person. That simple exchange, that little moment of mutual recognition, eased something between them and made the air feel less heavy. Moments like that one, when someone admits they're learning and someone else responds with kindness instead of blame, tend to remind people listening that all of us carry some weight we didn't expect. Many who hear stories like this have seen workplaces change for reasons they never understood, And sharing those experiences in the comments often brings others who feel the same way. It's in those conversations where strangers discover they're not alone, and the meaning of a moment grows beyond the story itself. Ethan looked back down at the screen and asked Dana how far the policy had spread. She swallowed hard and pulled up a final chart, one filled with red bars stretching across the map like warning lights. The deductions had affected thousands of workers across the country, and the total numbers were far higher than anything he imagined. He ran his hand over his face, shaking his head slowly, the sorrow layering itself with anger at how unnoticed this had gone. Dana placed the tablet on the table gently, telling him she believed he never intended something like this, but also reminding him that good intentions didn't soften the damage done. He nodded, accepting her words without defense, letting them settle into the part of him that knew he had to make this right. He thanked her again, this time with deeper sincerity, telling her that her honesty mattered more than she knew, and that she had helped him see everything more clearly. She told him she appreciated being heard, and that she hoped whatever he decided would protect people like Maya and Luis. That small show of trust warmed something in him and pushed him further toward the responsibility he knew he had to take. He left the room with the weight of the numbers still pressing on him, knowing that this was no accident and no misunderstanding. This was a system that grew in the shadows, and fixing it would cost money, reputation, and maybe even stability. As he stepped into the hallway, he felt the first spark of a much bigger decision forming, one that would test him more than any business crisis ever had. And the question that followed him out the door was the one he couldn't avoid anymore, the one that hung over him like a cloud waiting to break. Would he risk the financial fallout to tear this policy down once and for all? Ethan sat in the quiet of his car for a long moment after leaving Dana's office, the tablet still open on the passenger seat, its screen filled with numbers that felt heavier than any financial report he had ever read. He kept hearing Maya's voice in his mind, soft but steady, telling him she didn't want customers to feel bad, even when her paycheck shrank over mistakes that weren't her fault. That memory pushed him to grab his phone and call her, asking if she had a moment to talk. She sounded surprised, but she agreed, and they met behind the diner near the small break area where workers usually caught their breath between rushes. When she saw the expression on his face, she didn't ask questions. She just listened. He told her she had opened his eyes, that her kindness had a strength he hadn't fully understood until now. She shrugged in that gentle way she had, saying she never wanted to make problems worse and only wanted to make people's days a little lighter. Hearing her say that after everything she carried settled something deep in him. He felt ashamed he had not been closer to the ground before, ashamed he had let people like her carry burdens meant for leaders like him. She thanked him for caring, for even asking, and that simple gratitude made him want to do even more. In that moment, he silently made his choice. No matter what it cost, he would end the deduction policy for good. He didn't say it out loud yet, but she sensed something had shifted. She asked what he planned to do, and he told her in a careful tone that he wanted to fix what had gone wrong, even if it ruffled feathers higher up. She nodded slowly, telling him she believed change always starts with someone deciding enough is enough. Those words lingered with him as he drove away, a reminder that the courage she showed inside the diner came from a place more powerful than fear. Back at his temporary office, he opened his laptop and spread out all the reports Dana had shared. Each number, each line, each file pulled him deeper into the truth of how far the damage had spread. He wrote notes, highlighted anything that showed harm, and built a picture of a system gone off track without anyone meaning for it to become so cruel. His jaw tightened as he typed the first parts of a reform plan, knowing full well this would stir anger among people who valued profit more than people. Every sentence he wrote carried Maya's voice, Luis's concern, and Dana's honesty. And the more he committed to fixing the problem, the more he realized he was crossing a moral line he should have crossed years ago. He felt vulnerable admitting that to himself, yet it also made him stronger, clearer, more determined to defend what mattered. Moments like this have a way of echoing later, shaping the turns that are still ahead. And even if Ethan didn't know it yet, this private decision was about to test every part of him in ways he wasn't ready for. He printed the first draft of his reform proposal and stared at the pages spread across the table, feeling the weight of the decision on his shoulders. It wasn't just about right and wrong anymore. It was about facing people who would accuse him of risking profits, of acting emotionally, of threatening the company's stability. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't care about the noise. He cared about people like Maya and Luis, about the workers who kept the doors open day after day, about the promises he thought his company stood for. He wrote a note to himself at the top of the packet: "Fix the harm, not the image." That line stayed with him as he prepared the final outline for a meeting he hadn't yet called. His heart pounded with a mix of fear and clarity, but he kept going because he knew the truth had already changed him. And as he gathered the papers into a folder, he felt the faint tremor of what lay ahead, knowing this decision would either rebuild trust or tear open a fight he couldn't avoid. The only thing left now was to face the board and see if they still believed in the same kind of company he wanted to lead. But that question, lingering quietly in the back of his mind, refused to give him rest. Once they heard his plan, would they stand with him or turn on him entirely? Ethan stood outside the glass doors of the boardroom for a moment, breathing in slowly, feeling the cool air brush against his face as if the building itself were warning him to be careful. Inside, the long table gleamed under the lights, and the board members sat stiffly, their eyes following him as he walked toward the head seat. He carried the reform folder under his arm, the weight of it heavier than any report he had ever taken into a meeting. When he sat down, the room stayed silent long enough for him to hear the faint hum of the air vents, and then the questions came sharp and fast. They wanted to know why he was changing a cost control policy that had proven results, why he was thinking emotionally instead of strategically, why he would make a move that risked margins when the company had been performing well. Ethan felt each question like a push against his chest. He tried to explain the harm being done, the pain he had seen, the conversations that opened his eyes, but many of the faces staring back seemed more worried about numbers than people. He remembered Maya's gentle voice, the way she said kindness should not be wrapped in fear. That memory steadied him a little. He told the board the policy was hurting workers, that it wasn't ethical, that he couldn't lead a company where fear was part of the paycheck. A few members exchanged looks, and the tone of the meeting sharpened. One asked if he had forgotten his responsibility to shareholders. Another asked if he had been manipulated by a single emotional story, as if the truth could be dismissed that easily. Ethan kept his voice calm, but inside doubt pushed at him hard. He knew the reform plan would cost money. He knew undoing years of deductions meant public explanations, maybe even lawsuits. Still, when he looked down at the notes in front of him, he saw Maya's name written in the corner, and something inside him held firm. He said he would take responsibility for the decision, even if it meant facing backlash alone. The room went quiet again, but this time it wasn't respect, it was shock. The board demanded to see every part of the plan, flipping through pages as if searching for something to attack. He watched their reactions with a sinking feeling, noticing who frowned, who whispered, who leaned away like trying to create space between themselves and his choice. A few members softened when they saw the numbers of workers affected, but most stayed cold, calculating. As the meeting dragged on, Ethan felt a dull ache behind his eyes, the kind that came from knowing he was swimming against a current stronger than he expected. He stepped out for a moment, standing in the hallway, feeling the carpets under his shoes and the low rumble of office noise around him. His mind drifted to the diner again, to Maya's small smile, to the moment she confessed her truth without knowing who he really was. That memory was the only thing keeping his resolve from cracking completely. He walked back in, ready to defend his plan again, but before he could speak, every phone in the room buzzed at once. A sudden tension filled the air as the board members checked their screens with alarmed expressions. Ethan looked at his own phone and felt his stomach drop. Someone had leaked a memo about the reform plan. A news outlet had already posted it online, framing it as a massive shift in company policy. Reporters were tagging the company, demanding statements, calling it a potential scandal. The room erupted. Some board members accused him of mishandling internal information. Others warned of legal trouble. Someone raised their voice about market reactions and stock values. Ethan stood in the center of the storm, feeling the noise press in on him from every direction. For a moment, doubt cracked through his resolve. He wondered if he had acted too quickly, spoken too openly, trusted too much. Yet even with the world outside spinning faster than he could control, he knew the leak didn't change the truth. It only made the stakes higher. The pushback was no longer private. It was public, loud and ready to drag him down if he faltered. He closed the folder slowly, looking around the room, seeing every pair of eyes waiting to see whether he would back down or push forward. And somewhere in that tense silence, he felt the echo of Maya's bravery, the steady calm with which she faced her own fear every day. That memory rooted him again, reminding him why he started this fight. But as he stood there, Knowing the board might try to strip him of authority, a quiet question formed in his mind, one that tightened his breath as he faced the people who once trusted him without question. Had he just put himself in a position where he could lose control of his own company? Ethan stayed in the boardroom long after everyone else had walked out, the quiet settling around him like a heavy blanket he couldn't push off. For a while he just sat there staring at the empty chairs, feeling the weight of the leak, the anger, the confusion, and the fear that his own company might slip out of his hands. The lights above him hummed softly, and in that stillness, he felt the crash of everything he had tried to hold together. He picked up the folder again, flipping through pages without really seeing the words, hearing only Maya's calm voice in his memory. She had spoken with such gentle honesty, carrying a truth she never expected to matter beyond her small diner, yet her words had cracked open the entire empire he built. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, holding his head as he finally admitted to himself that he was at the lowest point he'd been in years. His name was on policies he never wanted, and the people who trusted his leadership were hurting because he hadn't noticed the damage sooner. That thought stung deeper than any accusation the board had thrown at him. Every memory of workers he'd met over the years floated back, and he saw their faces differently now, understanding how easy it was for leaders to drift too far from the lives they affected. He walked out of the boardroom slowly, the halls feeling longer, colder, like the building itself was judging him. He made his way to his office and shut the door behind him, letting the quiet swallow him whole. He sat at his desk and let the exhaustion sink in, rubbing his eyes as if that small gesture could erase the mistakes of an entire system. He thought about Maya again, about the strength behind her polite smile, about the way she tried to protect the cook from stress even though she carried her own. He remembered Luis's tired voice, the fear in his words, the resignation in his shoulders. Those images held him still, giving him clarity he didn't know he was reaching for. The empire had grown so large that parts of it no longer carried his values, and he realized that leadership meant standing up even when others fought back. It meant choosing what was right, not what was comfortable. In that moment, he knew there was no middle ground left for him. He would either stay silent and protect his reputation, or speak up and protect the people who needed it most. And the more he thought about it, the more the second choice felt like the only path he could live with. He stood up again, feeling a calmness settle inside him, the kind that comes when a person finally stops running from the truth. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began outlining a plan to confront the board publicly, not in secret and not in half measures. He would announce the end of the policy himself, take responsibility for the harm done, and commit openly to compensating every worker affected. The consequences didn't scare him anymore. Losing money, facing backlash, dealing with headlines, none of that mattered next to fixing the harm his company had allowed. He pictured Maya listening to that announcement, maybe from the diner, maybe during a break, and he hoped she would feel proud that her honesty meant something bigger than either of them expected. He hoped Luis would feel a weight lift off his shoulders. He hoped every worker across the country would finally feel seen. Moments like this always make a person wonder what they would do if they were in his place, standing between comfort and courage. Would they step forward the way he plans to, or hold back and hope someone else fixes things? And stories like this continue because people listening care about choices, justice, and second chances. So if this journey has kept you engaged so far, consider subscribing and staying with us, because these long stories take time and heart to create, and your presence here truly keeps them alive. Ethan folded the paper carefully and placed it on his desk, knowing the next step would change everything. The storm waiting ahead didn't scare him anymore. What mattered was that he finally saw the truth clearly. And as he turned off the lights and walked out of the office, he felt something he hadn't felt since the day he started his company. The sense that doing the right thing was worth any cost, even if the world wasn't ready for it yet. Everything was set for what came next, and the whole city outside felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the man who once built an empire to step forward and rebuild it with honesty this time. Ethan woke before sunrise the next morning, long before his alarm, long before the city outside began moving. For a moment he sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the weight of his decision pressing against his ribs, heavy enough to slow his breathing. He had chosen his path the night before, and now everything ahead would depend on how firmly he stood behind it. The announcement had to be made. No more secrets, no more whispers. He walked to the window and looked out at the quiet streets, knowing that within hours the world would know what his company had done and what he intended to do to fix it. The calm of the morning felt almost unreal compared to the storm he could already feel rising around him. When he reached the office, phones were ringing non-stop, email alerts flashing, and the legal team waiting outside his door. Shareholders had already heard the rumor, and some were calling emergency meetings, fearful of costs and public reactions. Ethan listened without flinching, but he didn't bend. Every word from them felt like a push toward backing down, yet the memory of Maya's tired smile kept him grounded. He told them he would address everything publicly soon, and they exchanged worried glances, unsure if he understood the gravity of what he was walking into. Managers from several regions joined a video call, some of them frustrated, others scared of what the announcement could mean for staffing budgets or their own careers. One threatened to step down if the policy was overturned. Another said the public would tear the company apart once the truth came out. Ethan kept his tone steady, explaining that the harm done to workers mattered more than the discomfort of admitting mistakes. Some softened when they heard the sincerity in his voice, but many stayed stiff, unwilling to support him. He thanked them anyway, feeling the distance between leadership layers like a crack spreading through glass. After the call, he sat back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment, letting the tension settle into something steadier. The world around him was shaking, but inside his resolve was turning into something stronger, sharper. He called public relations next, instructing them to prepare a press event for that evening. They hesitated, warning him that reporters were already digging into the leaked memo and that anything he said could be twisted. He accepted that risk without flinching. Silence had done enough damage already. He took a break from the calls and stepped outside for some air, leaning on the railing of the small balcony attached to his office. The wind tugged at his hair, and he stared down at the sidewalks far below, imagining people like Maya starting their morning shifts across the country. He wondered how many of them were already bracing for another day of pressure, another day hoping they wouldn't make a mistake they couldn't afford. That thought tightened something inside him, until he felt the sting of tears he didn't let fall. He knew the announcement wouldn't fix everything, but it would be a start, one that should have happened years ago. When he walked back inside, he called Maya, unsure if she would even want to be part of something so public. Her voice sounded unsure when she picked up, warm but cautious. He told her about the plan, about the press event, about wanting her to stand beside him, because the truth began with her honesty. She went quiet for a long moment, long enough for him to hear her shaky breath. She said she wasn't used to attention, that she didn't want to be seen as someone stirring trouble. He reassured her gently, saying he wanted people to see the kindness that opened his eyes, not a symbol of conflict. Still, she hesitated, and he didn't push her. He told her he would respect whatever she chose. That seemed to ease her, though she didn't give him an answer. He spent the next hours refining his speech, reading it out loud to hear where the truth felt strongest. He didn't hide from the guilt or the mistakes. He planned to name them clearly, to take responsibility without excuses. Lawyers dropped by his office again, warning him of lawsuits, angry investors, and potential long-term damage. He didn't ignore their concerns, but he didn't let them dictate his path either. This wasn't about money anymore. It was about the people who had carried the company's weight on their backs, while leaders like him stayed comfortable. He rewrote one line of the announcement again and again until it felt right, something simple but honest. A company should never grow by taking from those who already give everything they have. When he finally set the pen down, his hand felt steadier than it had all day. The world outside his office window grew darker, the city lights flickering on, reminding him how close he was to stepping into the spotlight with the truth in his hands. Before he moved forward, a thought crossed his mind, the kind that makes a person pause even when time is running out. If doing the right thing meant risking everything he built, was he ready for the fallout? And if he stayed silent, could he live with himself knowing the harm would continue? These were not questions anyone else could answer for him. What choice would someone listening make if they were standing exactly where he stood? As the evening approached, the pressure in the building felt thicker, like the walls themselves were bracing for impact. Assistants hurried around, cameras were set up in the main hall, and reporters waited outside. Ethan stood alone in his office, looking at the reflection of himself in the dark window. He barely recognized the man staring back, a man carrying fear, guilt, resolve, and something close to hope. He checked his phone one last time, wondering if Maya had decided. No message yet. He slipped the phone into his pocket and took a deep breath. Everything was ready. The next steps would shape the future of his entire company, maybe even his own legacy. And as he walked toward the hall where lights were already pointed at the podium, he felt the tension rise inside him like a drumbeat leading him forward. The announcement was moments away, and he could feel the world gathering on the other side of the cameras, waiting to see if he would break or stand firm. With every step he took, the pressure built, but so did the certainty that he was doing what needed to be done. And as the doors opened in front of him, he stepped through them, knowing that whatever happened after this would change everything in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Ethan stepped up to the podium with the weight of an entire empire sitting on his shoulders. The bright lights hit him first, sharp and unkind, and the sound of cameras clicking filled the room like restless rain. Reporters leaned forward, ready to dissect every breath he took. Behind him stood a line of managers and advisors, but there was an empty space at his right side, the space he had hoped Maya would fill. He had told her she didn't have to come. He meant it. Even so, her absence tugged at him as a reminder that ordinary people should never be forced to carry the consequences of leadership failures. He gripped the edges of the podium, cleared his throat, and the room fell into a tight silence. His voice wavered just slightly at the beginning, not from fear of the crowd but from the weight of what he was about to admit. He said the company had failed. He said he had failed. He spoke the words slowly and clearly, explaining that a policy he never meant to approve had silently spread through the system and taken money from workers' paychecks for simple errors. Gasps rose from the audience. Flashbulbs exploded. He kept talking, steadying his tone with each sentence, refusing to hide behind technical excuses. He said leaders must answer for what happens under their name, even when the truth is painful. Halfway through his speech, he heard the softest footsteps behind him. He didn't turn right away, afraid it was only his imagination. But when he finally did, Maya was there. She stood a few steps behind him, her face pale with nervousness, but her eyes calm. She didn't need to say anything. Her presence alone filled the hollow space at his side. The reporters erupted with new noise, scrambling for photos. Ethan stepped slightly aside, giving her room not as a symbol but as someone who deserved to be seen. He continued, saying her honesty had changed everything. That one sentence made the room shift again, quieter this time, like even the cameras were listening. Maya's hands were clasped together, trembling just a little, and Ethan felt a sudden surge of gratitude that she chose to be there even when she didn't have to. He finished the explanation of the policy, detailing how it had grown unnoticed and why it was being abolished effective immediately. He announced the compensation program, the audits, and the new protections for workers going forward. Every step of the plan drew mixed reactions from the crowd. Some reporters nodded with understanding. Others frowned, already shaping their headlines. When he paused for questions, the first voice that rose was sharp, asking if he was destroying his company with this decision. He answered calmly that a company built on fear wasn't worth protecting. Another reporter asked if this was all a publicity stunt to recover his image. He said no, because the right thing rarely makes anyone look good at first. A third asked how such a mistake could happen under his watch. His answer was simple: distance. He admitted he had let himself drift away from the day-to-day lives of his employees, trusting layers of decisions without checking if they honored his values. His voice cracked a little when he said that part. Maya looked at him then, her expression soft, as if she understood the weight behind those words better than anyone else in the room. Moments like that tend to hit people differently. Some feel relief at hearing a leader speak honestly. Others feel anger from old wounds of being unheard in their own jobs. And across rooms, cities, and screens, the shared reaction creates a quiet thread that ties strangers together for a moment, reminding them that truth can shake entire worlds when it's spoken out loud. As questions piled up, the room's energy spun between outrage and admiration. Some praised Ethan for taking responsibility. Some accused him of weakness, of letting emotions lead him into decisions that could break the company. Through it all, Maya stood behind him, not speaking, just being there. Her presence gave him courage he didn't know he needed. At one point, a reporter asked her directly why she came. She hesitated, then said softly that she showed up because she wanted people to know kindness still mattered, even when the world made it feel small. The room stilled at her words, not because they were loud, but because they were true in a way that hit deep. By the end of the conference, news outlets were already broadcasting fragments of his speech. Social media exploded with mixed reactions. Some posted gratitude for his honesty, others called him reckless. Stocks wavered, managers sent frantic updates, Advisors rushed around trying to control the narrative. Through all of it, Ethan kept his eyes forward. He knew storms didn't calm in a day. He also knew this moment was only the beginning of what he had to face. Maya walked beside him as they exited the hall, and though she looked overwhelmed, she managed a small smile when he thanked her for showing up. She said she didn't feel brave, but he told her bravery wasn't about being fearless. It was about standing up even when fear was loud. When he got back to his office, the silence felt sharper than before. He looked at the glowing city outside his window, unsure of what the next morning would bring. The empire he built was shaking, shifting under the weight of truth. The reactions of millions of people were now moving in waves he couldn't control. Everything hung in balance, suspended between collapse and transformation. And as he stood there, hands resting on the railing, the suspense tightened around him like a held breath, waiting for the world to exhale. Ethan stayed by the window long after the press conference ended, watching the city lights flicker like restless signals from a world he could no longer predict. The building felt different tonight, heavier, filled with whispers he couldn't hear, but could almost feel in the air. His phone vibrated non-stop on the desk behind him. Messages from worried investors, confused managers, angry executives, and a few quiet thank yous from employees he didn't even know. He didn't answer any of them yet. He needed a moment to breathe, to let the truth settle. When he finally turned around, his assistant stood in the doorway holding a folder with trembling hands. She told him the board had requested an emergency meeting for the next morning. Their tone, she said, sounded serious, too serious. Ethan could guess what that meant. Some members wanted him gone. His announcement had shaken the company so hard that people who once smiled at him in hallways now whispered behind closed doors about replacing him. He nodded slowly, feeling the fear creep in, despite everything he had prepared himself for. Losing control of the company he built wasn't just a business hit. It felt like losing a part of his life. But the guilt of doing nothing had felt worse, and he clung to that thought like an anchor in rough water. Messages from workers began appearing on social media within hours. At first it was just a few posts, blurry photos of time cards and stories typed in shaky sentences. Then dozens, then hundreds. Workers from every corner of the country shared moments they had kept quiet for years, explaining how deductions had cut into rent money, grocery budgets, and medical bills. People found each other in the comments, offering comfort, anger, and relief. Some defended Ethan, saying they felt hope for the first time in a long while. Others doubted his intentions, thinking the announcement might be a strategy rather than a change of heart. He read as many posts as he could, each one tightening something inside him, but also lighting a small flame of hope. The more people opened up, the more he realized how important it was for him to stand firm. In the middle of the flood of reactions, one photo caught his eye, a small snapshot someone had taken at the diner where this all began. It showed Maya wiping a counter while customers watched the news on a mounted TV. Her face was a mix of fear and pride, like someone realizing a wave she didn't mean to start had turned into a swell carrying thousands of voices. That image stayed with him as he continued reading. Meanwhile, inside the company, panic spread fast. Some store owners complained the announcement made them look careless. Regional managers said employees were questioning every rule now, some even walking into offices asking for explanations with new courage. Ethan didn't see that as trouble. He saw it as the first sign of healing, but others didn't agree. His legal team warned him the board was counting votes, trying to gauge how many members still trusted his leadership. A few of them he knew were already whispering about removing him before things spiraled further. They said the stock dip would turn permanent. They said public trust was fragile. They said fear was rising. Ethan listened, but he didn't bend. Even so, the fear inside him wasn't small. He had always known leadership came with storms, but he never imagined a storm this size would come from his own walls. Later that night, when he stepped outside for air again, he felt that strange quiet in his chest, the feeling that choices made today would explode in tomorrow's meeting. It was the kind of moment where a person senses a shift coming, even before it has a name. He walked down to the building's lobby, where screens on the wall played news segments looping his announcement. Some networks praised his honesty, others accused him of trying to save his image. A few questioned whether he still deserved control of the company. He watched the clips in silence, seeing himself through the cold eye of someone else's camera, vulnerable, determined, tired, human. Maya's presence in the footage, standing behind him with her hands clasped, added a softness the public hadn't expected. Some online comments called her brave, Some called her the heart of the whole issue. Workers started using her name as a hashtag, sharing their own photos and stories under posts, thanking her for speaking up. She didn't try to be a symbol, but people made her into one anyway, and Ethan wondered how she felt about becoming the face of a truth bigger than her small diner shifts. By midnight, internal emails leaked again. This time it wasn't the reform plan. It was a rumor that some board members had already drafted a statement to remove him as CEO if the vote went a certain way. The message spread quickly online, fueling more arguments and fear. Reporters camped outside the building waiting for comment. Employees stayed up late, refreshing feeds, hoping for clarity. Every corner of the company felt the tension, as if walls and screens and whispers all held the same tight breath. Ethan stayed in his office, lights low, staring at the draft of his speech for the next morning's meeting. He knew the vote would decide everything, not just his job but the future of the company's values. He wondered if Maya was awake too, watching the chaos from her small apartment, wondering if her honesty had broken things beyond repair or helped them start changing. He wished he could call her, but he didn't want to add to her worry. The night stretched long and thin, and by the time the horizon began to lighten, Ethan still hadn't slept. He printed his final notes, smoothing the pages with steady hands even though his heart beat unevenly. He walked to the window and watched the sun rise over the city, turning buildings golden, giving everything a calm glow that didn't match the storm waiting inside the walls below. Hope and fear twisted together inside him, impossible to separate. Workers were finding their voices, the board was sharpening theirs. And he stood between them, tired but steady, knowing the next meeting would decide whether he continued leading or became another story of a leader replaced during turmoil. Yet under all that tension, one thin thread of optimism still held. People were speaking, connecting, telling truths they had carried alone for too long. Something real was shifting, even if the price was high. When he walked out of his office toward the meeting room, people watched him quietly from their desks. Some nodded, some looked away, some seemed unsure of what they felt, but every glance carried the same question, the one he now felt echoing in his chest with every step he took. Would he survive the vote, or would this be the end of his time as the head of the empire he built? Ethan walked into the boardroom with the kind of silence that only comes before a life-changing moment. The long table was already full, papers stacked, screens lit, faces tight with tension. No one greeted him. No small talk, just eyes following him as he took his seat. The air felt thick, heavy enough that even breathing felt like work. He placed his notes in front of him, though he already knew he wouldn't look at them. This wasn't a moment for numbers or speeches. This was the moment everything he believed about leadership would be tested. The chair of the board cleared her throat and announced that the vote on his leadership would begin shortly. Ethan felt a pulse of fear run through him, sharp and cold, but he didn't let it reach his voice when he spoke. He said simply that whatever the outcome, he stood by his decision to end the deduction policy and repair the harm. Some members avoided his gaze, others looked angry. A few looked unsure, like they were still weighing their conscience against their comfort. As comments and arguments broke out around the table, the room became a swirl of raised voices and clashing fears. One member insisted the company would lose millions. Another accused Ethan of losing touch with the reality of business. Someone else snapped that kindness had no place in corporate policy. Ethan listened, letting their words wash over him, not because he agreed, but because he wanted to understand the fear driving them. When he finally spoke again, his voice was steady, almost soft. He said a company could not call itself strong while standing on the backs of exhausted workers. He said if leadership had to choose between profit and people, then they had already lost their way. For a moment the room went still. His hands trembled under the table, but his eyes didn't drop. He had reached his limit of pretending strength meant silence. Then the door opened. Everyone turned. Maya stepped inside. She looked nervous, unsure, but she held her chin high. Ethan's heart thudded hard in his chest. He hadn't asked her to come. She hadn't told him she planned to. She walked to the front slowly, her steps small but sure. The chair of the board frowned, asking what she was doing there. Maya said she came to speak, not as a symbol, not as a victim, but as someone who loved her job and just wanted honesty to matter again. Ethan felt his throat tighten. She turned to the table and said she had worked in customer service for years, seen people break under pressure, seen kindness become rare, and yet she tried every day to carry it anyway. She said mistakes were part of being human, and that punishing workers for them didn't build strength, it built fear. She said a company was only as good as the people who opened its doors each morning, and those people deserved respect, not punishment for slipping up when they were tired or overwhelmed. Her words were quiet but heavy, touching parts of the room numbers had never reached. Some board members shifted uncomfortably, others stared straight at her, something changing in their eyes. When she said Ethan had listened, not just to her but to the truth, something cracked open in the mood of the room. She said leadership wasn't about being perfect. It was about choosing kindness, even when it cost something. She looked at him when she said that last part, her voice shaking just enough to show her fear, but her courage shining through anyway. Ethan blinked hard, feeling the mix of pride and gratitude rise in him like a tide he couldn't hold back. The chair called for order and announced that the vote would proceed. Papers were handed out, pens clicked. Each member marked their choice, keep Ethan or remove him. The scratching of pens across paper sounded louder than the crowd of reporters outside. Ethan tried not to watch each face, but he saw worry, doubt, anger, and something else, something softer, shifting between expressions. When the chair collected the ballots, Ethan felt every heartbeat press against his ribs. He looked at Maya, who gave him the smallest nod, as if telling him that no matter what happened next, the truth was worth it. The chair began counting silently, line by line. A board member whispered a prayer under her breath. Another tapped his foot nervously. Ethan gripped the edge of the table just to steady himself. When the chair reached the final vote, she paused for a long moment. The room leaned into that silence, stretched tight like a wire ready to snap. Then she looked up, her voice controlled but not cold. Ethan would remain as CEO, the policy would be abolished, compensation would proceed. The room erupted, not in applause, not in relief, but in stunned noise, half frustration and half acceptance. Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding, a trembling exhale that felt like letting go of a lifetime of pressure. Maya closed her eyes briefly, her shoulders dropping, tears gathering that she quickly wiped away. He didn't need words to understand what that moment meant to her. Some board members stood and walked out, upset and shaken. Others approached him cautiously, admitting they still had doubts, but were willing to try a new direction. Ethan thanked them softly, not as a victor, but as someone humbled by the cost of change. When the room finally began to empty, he and Maya stood alone near the center of the long table. She told him she had never spoken in front of leaders before, and he told her that her voice had changed everything. She smiled gently, saying kindness had to come from someone, and today it came from both of them. He felt a warmth in his chest at her words, something steady and rooted. As they left the boardroom together, the noise of reporters outside grew louder, waiting for what came next. Ethan knew the fight wasn't over. Policies needed rebuilding. Trust needed healing. People needed proof that change wasn't just a speech but a promise kept. But as he walked beside Maya, feeling the weight of the vote settling into something solid inside him, he knew the hardest part was over. The empire hadn't fallen. It had shifted. It had made room for something better. And as the elevator doors closed behind them, the image of Maya standing bravely before a room of powerful people stayed with him like a light that refused to go out, guiding him toward the final steps, still waiting ahead. Ethan spent the next weeks moving through rooms that once felt familiar, but now held a new kind of light. Every office he walked into, every meeting he led, every memo he sent, carried the weight of what had happened, but also the warmth of what was finally being repaired. The policy was officially abolished across every franchise. No quiet phrasing, no gradual rollout. It was gone. In its place came a clear promise that no worker would ever lose money because of a mistake again. Compensation for all affected employees was announced in every region at the same time, and even though the cost was enormous, Ethan felt lighter watching the relief spread through teams who had braced themselves for years. Some cried when they opened their checks, some hugged managers, some simply sat down in their cars and breathed for a long time before driving home. Those reactions stayed with him more than any stock report or board update. He watched managers who once defended the old rule slowly shift, understanding that correcting a wrong felt better than guarding a flawed routine. And across all of it, Maya's role grew quietly and steadily. She didn't want speeches or praise. She preferred the quieter rooms, the round tables where she sat with employees and listened to what fairness should look like in their daily lives. Ethan invited her to help design the new employee protection program, and at first she hesitated, saying she didn't know anything about systems, but he told her she knew something more important: how people feel when they're treated right or wrong. She agreed, still shy but determined, and soon she became the heart of the initiative. Workers trusted her. They talked to her. They told her things they didn't know how to express before. And through every meeting, Ethan watched her kindness turn into something structured and strong, a compass for leaders who had forgotten how to read their own values. He met with her often, sometimes for long talks, sometimes just for a quiet moment of thanks. She always brushed off the praise, but he could see she was proud of what they were building. As the program took form, Ethan decided it was time to close the circle. He drove back to the diner, not undercover this time, not hiding behind plain clothes or a quiet